Man alone was untouched at 42 until she asked if she could sleep near the fireplace. The storm hit Medicine Creek without warning, turning the dusty streets into rivers of mud and driving every soul indoors. Every soul except two. Thomas McKenna pressed his weathered face against the cabin window, watching lightning split the Montana sky. At 42, he had grown accustomed to solitude. The ranch hands called him the loneliest man in 3 counties, and Thomas never bothered correcting them. Loneliness implied wanting company. Thomas had simply learned to prefer the silence. The knock on his door came soft at first, barely audible above the thunder, then stronger, more desperate. He opened it to find a young woman drenched to the bone, her traveling dress clinging to her slight frame. Water dripped from her dark hair, forming puddles on his threshold. She could not have been more than 20, with eyes the color of storm clouds and lips that trembled from cold or fear, perhaps both. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely cutting through the wind. "I need shelter." Thomas had not spoken to another human being in 6 weeks. The words felt foreign on his tongue when he finally managed them. "You best come in." She stepped inside, leaving wet footprints on the rough wooden floor. Her eyes swept across the sparse interior, a single room dominated by a stone fireplace, a narrow bed pushed against the far wall, shelves lined with books and empty bottles. The kind of place where a man went to disappear from the world. "I am Sarah," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Sarah Coleman. My wagon broke down about 5 miles west. The horses ran off when the lightning started." Thomas nodded toward the fire crackling in the hearth. "Warm yourself. I will fix you something hot." He moved to the kitchen area, his movements careful and deliberate. Everything in his world had its place, its purpose. Beans in one jar, coffee in another. A life measured in precise portions, calculated to last exactly as long as he needed it to. Sarah approached the fireplace, her wet clothes steaming in the heat. Thomas tried not to watch her, but 20 years of isolation had not prepared him for this moment. The way she moved with unconscious grace, the soft sounds she made as warmth returned to her fingers. "You live alone," she observed, not a question but a statement of fact. "I do." "How long?" Thomas ladled beans into a tin bowl, considering. "Since my father died, 7 years now." 7 years without speaking to anyone? "I speak to the cattle. Sometimes the horses." For the first time since entering, Sarah smiled. It transformed her entire face, chasing away the shadows that had made her seem almost ghostly in the doorway. "And what do they say back?" "More than most people." She laughed a sound like water over smooth stones. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, a stirring he had not experienced in so long he had forgotten its name. He handed her the bowl and a spoon, their fingers brushing for just an instant. Her skin was still cold from the storm, soft in a way that made his own hands feel like tree bark. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. They ate in comfortable silence, the storm raging outside while inside, 2 strangers shared warmth and simple food. Thomas found himself stealing glances at her face in the firelight, noting the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes. She was running from something, he could tell that much. People did not end up alone on backcountry roads during storms unless they were fleeing. "Where were you headed?" he asked eventually. "California, San Francisco." She set down her empty bowl. "My father arranged a marriage to a man I have never met." The words hung in the air between them. Thomas understood running. He had been doing it in his own way for years. "Arrangements like that rarely consider what the woman wants," he said. "No, they do not." Her voice carried a bitter edge. "Mr. Patterson owns 3 silver mines and a railroad. My father owns considerable debt. I am simply part of the transaction." Thomas poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Outside, the storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, the wind had grown stronger, howling through the gaps in the walls like a living thing. "The storm will not pass tonight," he said. "You are welcome to stay." Sarah looked around the one-room cabin, her gaze settling on the single bed. "I do not wish to impose. The floor by the fire is warm. I have extra blankets," she nodded gratefully. "If I could sleep near the fireplace, I would be in your debt." Thomas retrieved quilts from a trunk beneath the window, hand-sewn by his mother decades earlier. As he arranged them on the floor, Sarah began removing her wet outer garments, hanging her traveling coat and dress over chairs to dry. She wore a simple white chemise underneath, modest but revealing enough to make Thomas turn away, heat rising in his face. When he looked back, she had wrapped herself in one of the quilts, only her head visible above the colorful fabric. "Better?" he asked. "Much." She settled onto the makeshift bed, her head pillowed on her folded arms. "Thomas?" "Yes?" "Why did you choose this life? The isolation?" He sat in his single chair, studying her face in the dancing light. The question was more complex than she knew. "I was engaged once. Her name was Catherine. She died of fever 3 days before our wedding." Sarah's expression softened. "I am sorry. After that, people kept trying to fix me. Find me another wife, get me back to town, make me join their church socials and barn dances. They meant well, but they could not understand that some breaks do not heal. Some people are meant to be alone. And you believe that? That you are meant to be alone?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames flicker across her features. "I believed it this morning." The admission surprised them both. Sarah propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face. "What changed?" He met her eyes across the small room. "You knocked on my door." The storm raged through the night, but inside the cabin, something else was building. Not the desperate passion of romance novels, but something deeper, a recognition. Two souls who had been running, one from obligation, one from connection, finding themselves in the same small space, sharing the same fire. Sarah fell asleep first, her breathing deep and even. Thomas remained in his chair, unwilling to break the spell by moving to his bed. He had grown so accustomed to silence that even her quiet breathing seemed like music. Near dawn, the wind finally died. Thomas dozed in his chair, his body protesting the uncomfortable position, but his spirit oddly at peace. He woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Sarah had found his provisions and was cooking breakfast, her hair braided down her back, his spare shirt hanging loose over her recovered dress. "I hope you do not mind," she said without turning around. "I wanted to do something in return for your kindness." Thomas stretched, working kinks out of his neck. "I cannot remember the last time someone cooked in this kitchen." She served him eggs and bacon on his only plate, taking her portion in the tin bowl from the night before. They ate as morning light filtered through the windows, revealing the damage from the storm. Trees down across the yard, part of his fence blown away, debris scattered everywhere. "I should help you clean up," Sarah said, following his gaze. "You should be getting to California." She set down her fork. "Should I?" The question hung between them like a bridge half built, waiting to see who would take the first step across. "Your wagon is broken. Your horses are gone. It would take days to get you back to the main road." "That is not what I meant, and you know it." Thomas looked at her, really looked. At the determination in her posture, the hope she was trying to hide, the way she had transformed his solitary space simply by being in it. "What are you asking, Sarah?" She took a breath, gathering courage. "I am asking if you meant what you said last night, about this morning being different." 7 years of careful isolation warred with something Thomas had thought was dead. The part of him that had once believed in partnership, in shared dreams, in the possibility that two people could build something stronger together than either could manage alone. "I meant it," he said quietly. "Then I have a proposition for you." Thomas waited. "Let me stay, not as a guest, not as charity. As a partner, I can cook, I can mend, I can help with the cattle. I am stronger than I look, and I learn quickly. Sarah, you do not understand what you are asking. This life, it is hard. Isolated. The nearest town is 30 miles away. Winter lasts 6 months. There are wolves, storms, drought. People die out here from things that would barely slow you down in civilization. She stood, moving to the window that faced west toward the mountains. And what waits for me in San Francisco? A marriage to a stranger who sees me as property. A life where every decision is made for me, where I exist only to bear children and host dinner parties for my husband's business associates. She turned back to him, her eyes fierce with conviction. At least here I would have a choice. At least here I would matter. Thomas felt the walls he had spent 7 years building begin to crumble. Not the protective solitude, but the bitter certainty that he was meant to live and die alone. You would have to learn to shoot, he said. Ride, handle cattle. The work would break your hands and burn your skin. Then teach me. You might hate it, hate me, want to leave. I might, but I also might not. Thomas stood and walked to her, stopping close enough to see the flecks of gold in her gray eyes, close enough to smell the wood smoke in her hair. If you stay, there is no going back. No changing your mind when things get difficult. This country does not forgive hesitation. Sarah reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his weathered cheek. It was the first gentle touch he had received in 7 years. Then it is good that I am not hesitating. The kiss that followed was inevitable as sunrise, soft at first, then deeper as 7 years of loneliness met 20 years of dreams deferred. When they finally separated, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. I do not know how to do this, he whispered, how to be with someone again. Neither do I, she replied, but we can learn together. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the storm clouds. There would be work to do, fence to repair, debris to clear, preparations to make for the harsh winter ahead. But for the first time in 7 years, Thomas McKenna would not be doing it alone. That afternoon, they rode out together to look for her horses. Sarah proved to be a natural rider, adapting quickly to his spare gelding. They found the animals grazing in a meadow 5 miles north, her wagon overturned but salvageable. We can fix this, Thomas said, examining the broken wheel. Use it to haul supplies from town. Sarah nodded, but her attention was fixed on something else, a small wooden box that had spilled from her luggage, its contents scattered in the grass. She knelt and began gathering up letters, photographs, small keepsakes. Thomas picked up a daguerreotype that had landed near his feet. It showed a young woman in an elaborate wedding dress, posing stiffly beside a man in uniform. Your mother? He asked. Yes, on her wedding day. Sarah took the photograph, her thumb tracing the image. She married my father when she was 18. Died when I was 15. I sometimes wonder what she would have thought of my running away. Thomas considered this. What do you think she would have said? Sarah smiled, slipping the photograph back into the box. She would have asked if you were a good man. And? I would have told her yes. They worked until sunset repairing the wagon wheel, their movements gradually synchronizing as they learned each other's rhythms. Sarah proved to have quick hands and good instincts, anticipating what Thomas needed before he asked. As they rode back to the cabin, she asked, What happens now? Practically, I mean? Thomas had been thinking about this all day. We need supplies for winter. Food, warm clothes for you, ammunition. I will have to go to town soon. Will you tell them about me? He glanced at her, noting the worry in her voice. What would you prefer? I suppose we cannot keep it secret forever, but perhaps we could say I am your cousin from back east, visiting for a few months? Thomas nodded. That would give us time to figure out the rest. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the horses picking their way carefully over the storm-damaged ground. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas? Sarah's voice was thoughtful. Last night, when you said some breaks do not heal, do you still believe that? He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, His voice was rough with emotion. "I think maybe they do not heal. But maybe they can grow into something else. Something stronger." That night, they sat by the fire after dinner, Thomas reading aloud from one of his books while Sarah mended a tear in his shirt. It was such a simple, domestic scene, yet it felt revolutionary to a man who had spent years in solitude. "You have a good voice for reading," she said, not looking up from her needlework. "Did you go to school?" "Until I was 16. My father needed help with the ranch after that." "What did you want to be?" "Before?" Thomas set the book aside. "A teacher, I think. I like the idea of helping people learn things." Sarah smiled. "You can still do that. Teach me about the cattle, the land, how to survive out here. It is not the same as a real classroom." "Maybe not, but it matters more." Over the following days, they fell into a rhythm. Mornings began with coffee and planning the day's work. Thomas taught Sarah to milk the cow, tend the vegetable garden, identify edible plants in the surrounding hills. She learned to read weather signs and cloud formations and wind patterns, to tell the difference between the track of a deer and that of a wolf. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire. Sometimes Thomas read, sometimes Sarah would share stories of her childhood in Ohio. She had been raised by a father who saw her as an asset to be traded, but she had still managed to acquire an education, reading everything she could find, learning French from the minister's wife, developing opinions that scandalized the local society ladies. "I once told Mrs. Henderson that women should have the vote," she confided one night. She nearly fainted into her tea. Thomas chuckled. "And what did you think women would do with the vote?" "Change things. Make them better. Stop wars before they start. Fix problems instead of ignoring them. You have strong opinions for someone so young." Sarah looked at him across the fire. "Age is not the only way to gain wisdom. Sometimes hardship teaches you faster than years." A week after her arrival, Thomas made the trip to town for supplies. He had dreaded this moment, knowing that his sudden need for women's clothing and extra food would raise questions. Medicine Creek consisted of a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of houses clustered around a single dusty street. Thomas had been coming here for years, buying only what he absolutely needed and speaking to no one more than necessary. McKenna, the store owner, Jim Patterson, greeted him. "Been a while," Thomas nodded, placing his list on the counter. Patterson's eyebrows rose as he read it. "Women's dress, size small, boots? What are you up to out there?" "My cousin from Ohio," Thomas said, sticking to their agreed story. "Visiting for a few months." "Cousin, eh?" Patterson grinned. "Pretty cousin?" Thomas met his gaze steadily until the man looked away, suddenly interested in gathering the requested items. Word spread quickly in a town of 300 people. By the time Thomas finished loading his wagon, half the population seemed to have found reasons to be on the street, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of him or ask casual questions about his mysterious cousin. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual. Thomas found himself wondering if he had made a mistake, bringing outside attention to their carefully constructed piece. But when he crested the hill above his cabin and saw Sarah hanging laundry on a line she had strung between two trees, her hair bright in the afternoon sun, he knew no mistake had been made. Only a choice. The first real choice he had made in 7 years. That evening, Sarah tried on her new clothes while Thomas pretended to read. The simple frontier dress transformed her from a refugee from polite society into someone who belonged in this harsh landscape. The boots were practical, meant for walking on rough ground and working with livestock, but on her, they looked elegant. "How do I look?" she asked, spinning in a circle. "Like you were born here," Thomas replied, and meant it. The weeks that followed brought the first real tests of their partnership. A section of fence went down, and Sarah insisted on helping repair it despite having never handled a hammer before. She worked beside Thomas in the blazing sun, her hands blistering, sweat staining her new dress, but never complaining. When a storm spooked the cattle and scattered them across 3 valleys, Sarah rode with Thomas for 2 days straight, helping gather the herd. She learned to read the animals' moods, to anticipate their movements, to work in partnership with Thomas and his border collie to guide them home. But it was during a confrontation with wolves that Sarah truly proved she belonged. Thomas was checking on a sick calf in a remote pasture when they appeared, 3 gray shadows emerging from the tree line, moving with the fluid coordination of a pack that had hunted together for years. The calf was too weak to run, and Thomas was too far from the cabin to call for help. He had his rifle, but 3 wolves were more than one man could handle safely. As he raised the weapon, preparing to make his shots count, he heard the thunder of hoofbeats behind him. Sarah rode hard across the meadow, his spare rifle in her hands, her face set with determination. She dismounted while her horse was still moving, taking a position that gave her a clear line of sight while covering Thomas's flank. The wolves paused, confused by this sudden change in odds. In that moment of hesitation, Thomas fired. The lead wolf dropped, and the others vanished back into the forest as quickly as they had appeared. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Thomas asked, still shaken by how close they had come to disaster. "My father taught me," Sarah replied, checking her rifle before reloading. "He said a woman alone might need to defend herself." "Your father sounds like a practical man." "He was. About some things." She looked toward the tree line where the wolves had disappeared. "Will they come back?" "Not today. But we will need to be more careful about checking the outlying pastures alone." That night, as they sat by the fire, Thomas found himself studying Sarah's profile in the dancing light. The woman who had knocked on his door during a storm was gone, replaced by someone harder, more resilient, shaped by weeks of physical labor and constant vigilance. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The life you left behind?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "I miss some things. Hot baths, books, conversations about something other than cattle and weather. But," she looked at him, her gray eyes reflecting the firelight, "but I do not miss feeling useless. I do not miss being told what to think, what to want, who to marry. Here my choices matter. My work matters. Even when it is dangerous? Especially then." Thomas reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. Her palm was calloused now from weeks of hard work, but still soft against his weathered skin. "I am glad you knocked on my door," he said, "even though it complicated your perfectly ordered life." "Because it complicated my perfectly ordered life." The first frost came in late September, coating the grass with silver crystals that melted at the first touch of sunlight. Thomas woke to find Sarah already up, standing at the window in her nightgown, watching their breath fog the glass. "Winter is coming," she said. "Are you ready for it?" She turned to him, and in her eyes he saw not fear but anticipation. "With you?" "Yes." They spent the following weeks in frantic preparation. Firewood to cut and stack, vegetables to harvest and store, meat to smoke and preserve. Sarah worked beside Thomas with tireless energy, her movements now efficient and sure. On the day of the first real snow, they stood together on the porch, watching fat flakes drift down from a pewter sky. The landscape transformed before their eyes, harsh edges softened into gentle curves, the whole world wrapped in pristine white. "Beautiful," Sarah breathed. "And deadly," Thomas added, but not unkindly. "We will be snowed in for months. Just us, the cabin, and whatever provisions we have managed to store." Sarah slipped her arm through his, leaning against his shoulder. "I can think of worse ways to spend the winter." That night, as they prepared for bed, the careful distance they had maintained since her arrival finally collapsed. Sarah had been sleeping by the fireplace for months. But with winter settling over the valley like a heavy blanket, the cabin's single room seemed to shrink around them. "Thomas," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind rattling the windows, "I am cold." He looked at her, huddled in her quilts by the dying fire, and made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "Come here," he said, pulling back the covers on his narrow bed. She came to him without hesitation, sliding under the blankets and into his arms. For a moment they simply held each other, sharing warmth and comfort. Then Sarah lifted her face to his, and the kiss that followed was different from their first, deeper, more desperate, full of the knowledge that they had chosen each other not in the heat of a moment, but through months of shared hardship and growing trust. What happened next was quiet and gentle, two people who had been alone too long finding solace in connection. Afterward, they lay intertwined in the narrow bed, listening to the storm rage outside their small sanctuary. "Are you all right?" Thomas whispered against her hair. "Better than all right," Sarah replied. "For the first time in my life, I am exactly where I am supposed to be." The winter that followed was the hardest Thomas had ever experienced, but also the happiest. Snow piled against the windows until the cabin felt like a cave carved from ice. Some days, they could barely open the door against the drifts. But inside, warmed by fire and love, they created their own world. Sarah proved to be a gifted storyteller, spinning tales that made the long evenings pass like minutes. Thomas taught her to play chess with pieces he carved from scraps of wood. They read every book in his collection twice, discussing philosophy and poetry by firelight. When the coffee ran out in January, they learned to make tea from pine needles. When the last of the sugar was gone, they sweetened their food with honey from the hive Thomas maintained behind the cabin. Everything became precious, rationed, shared. "Do you think we will make it?" Sarah asked one particularly brutal night when the wind howled like a living thing and the cabin shook under its assault. "We will make it," Thomas replied with absolute certainty. "We have everything we need. Food for another month, maybe less." "That is not what I meant." She looked at him across the chessboard where they had been playing by candlelight. "What did you mean?" "We have each other. Everything else is just details." Spring arrived gradually, then all at once. The sound of dripping water became constant as snow melted from the roof. Ice cracked and shifted in the nearby creek. Birds returned to sing in the cottonwoods around the cabin. On the first truly warm day, Thomas and Sarah ventured outside together, blinking in the bright sunlight like creatures emerging from hibernation. The world looked different, familiar landmarks obscured by fallen trees, new channels carved by snowmelt, the whole landscape rearranged by winter's fury. "We made it," Sarah said, wonder in her voice. "We did." They spent the morning assessing damage, making lists of repairs needed before the next winter. A section of the roof had leaked, part of the corral fence was down, and they had lost several cattle to wolves or cold. But the core of what they had built together remained intact. That afternoon, as they worked side by side repairing the chicken coop, Sarah suddenly straightened, one hand pressed to her stomach. "What is it?" Thomas asked, alarmed by her expression. She looked at him, her gray eyes wide with something between wonder and terror. "I think I might be pregnant." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge to a future they had not dared imagine. Thomas set down his hammer, his hand suddenly unsteady. "Are you certain?" "No, but I have been feeling sick in the mornings and I am late, and ... She trailed off, searching his face for his reaction. Thomas crossed to her in 3 quick strides, taking her face in his calloused hands. "How do you feel about it? The possibility?" "Scared," she admitted, "but also happy. I never thought I would have children by choice, with someone I loved, and I never thought I would have a family at all." Thomas kissed her forehead gently. "We will figure it out. Whatever happens, we will face it together." By summer, Sarah's pregnancy was undeniable. Her body changed, growing round with new life, but also somehow more powerful. She continued to work alongside Thomas, though he insisted on taking over the heavier tasks. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she protested when he tried to stop her from lifting a bale of hay. "Humor me," he replied. "I have never done this before." "Neither have I." They began preparations for the birth with the methodical thoroughness they brought to everything else. Thomas read every medical book he could find, while Sarah sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric ordered from town. They converted a corner of the cabin into a makeshift nursery, building a cradle from pine planks and lining it with quilts. The baby arrived on a crisp October morning, just as the leaves were turning gold on the cottonwoods. Sarah's labor was long and difficult, but she faced it with the same determination she had brought to learning ranch life. Thomas held her hand through the worst of it, whispering encouragement and promises. When their son finally arrived red-faced and howling with outrage at being thrust into the world, Thomas wept openly for the first time since Catherine's death. "He is perfect," Sarah whispered, exhausted but radiant as she cradled their child against her chest. "Like his mother," Thomas replied. They named him Daniel, after Sarah's grandfather, and he became the center of their universe in the way that only a first child can. The cabin that had once been a refuge for one lonely man became a home for a family, filled with the sounds of life crying, laughing, the soft murmur of lullabies in the small hours of the night. Years passed. Daniel grew from infant to toddler to a sturdy boy who followed his father around the ranch like a shadow. Sarah bloomed in motherhood, her strength multiplying rather than diminishing. She could manage the household, help with the cattle, and raise their son all with a competence that amazed Thomas daily. Other children followed, a daughter named Catherine, then twin boys they called James and Robert. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family, rooms added on as needed, the single fireplace supplemented with a proper stove. The town of Medicine Creek grew as well, connected by railroad to the wider world. Thomas and Sarah became respected members of the community, their strange beginning forgotten in the face of their obvious devotion to each other and their children. But it was on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and they sat together by the fire, that Thomas was most grateful for the storm that had brought Sarah to his door. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not stopped here?" he asked one such evening 20 years after that first night. Sarah, her hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes still the same storm gray that had captured his heart, smiled and took his hand. "No," she said simply, "because this is what was supposed to happen. Everything else was just the journey that led us here." Outside, snow began to fall again, the first of another winter. But inside their warm home, surrounded by the evidence of a life well built together, Thomas McKenna was no longer the loneliest man in 3 counties. On this particular evening, as wind rattled the shutters and flames danced in the hearth, their eldest son Daniel approached his father with a question that had been troubling him. "Papa," the boy said, settling beside Thomas on the worn leather chair they had shared for storytelling since he could walk, "Jimmy Morrison at school says you and Mama were not really married when she first came here." Thomas felt Sarah's eyes on him from across the room where she was mending one of the twins' shirts. They had always planned to tell the children the truth when they were old enough to understand, but somehow the years had slipped away. "What do you think about that?" Thomas asked carefully. Daniel, now 13 and possessed of his mother's direct gaze, considered this. "I think it does not matter when the preacher said words over you. I think you were married the night Mama chose to stay." Sarah set down her needlework and moved to join them, settling on the arm of Thomas's chair with practiced ease. "Your son is wise," she said, running her fingers through Daniel's dark hair, "but he deserves the whole truth." And so, as snow accumulated outside their windows and the younger children slept peacefully in their beds, Thomas and Sarah told their eldest the full story of that stormy night 20 years ago. How she had been running from an arranged marriage, how he had been hiding from the possibility of love, how a broken wagon wheel and a fierce storm had brought them together. Daniel listened with the intense concentration he brought to everything, asking occasional questions about details that seemed important to his young mind. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "So you saved each other," he said finally. "Yes," Sarah replied. "We did." And that is why you named the ranch Haven Creek? Thomas smiled. The name had come to them naturally, a reflection of what their home had become, not just a shelter from storms, but a refuge where broken things could heal and new life could take root. Among other reasons, he said. Later, after Daniel had gone to bed, Thomas and Sarah remained by the fire, comfortable in the silence they had shared for 2 decades. The years had weathered them both. Thomas's hair was completely gray now. Sarah's hands bore the permanent stains of work and motherhood, but their connection had only deepened. "Do you think we did right?" Sarah asked, telling him everything. He would have figured it out eventually. Better he hear it from us. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, and Thomas marveled again at how perfectly she fit against him, as if they had been designed as 2 halves of a whole. "Sometimes I try to imagine what would have happened if I had made it to San Francisco," she said. "If I had married Mr. Patterson and lived the life my father planned for me. And I cannot. It feels like trying to remember someone else's dream." Thomas understood. His own past, the years of isolation, the careful emptiness he had cultivated seemed equally foreign now. He was a different man than the one who had opened his door to a storm-soaked stranger. Just as Sarah was no longer the frightened young woman fleeing an unwanted marriage. "The children want to hear the story of the wolves again tomorrow," Sarah said, referring to the tale that had become family legend, how their mother had ridden to their father's rescue, rifle in hand, fierce as any frontier warrior. "You enjoy being the hero of that story. I enjoy being your partner in all the stories." They sat in comfortable silence until the fire burned low, then made their way to the bedroom they had shared for 19 years. As they settled under quilts, Sarah had sewn herself from fabric Thomas had chosen on his trips to town. She turned to face him in the darkness. "Thomas? Thank you." "For what?" "For opening the door." He pulled her closer, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair soap and wood smoke, and something that was uniquely Sarah. "Thank you for knocking." The next morning brought the crisis that would test everything they had built together. Thomas was checking on the horses when young Catherine came running from the house, her face white with terror. "Papa!" "Mama collapsed. She will not wake up." Thomas ran faster than he had in years, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found Sarah on the kitchen floor, unconscious but breathing, her skin pale and clammy. The twins stood in the doorway, crying, while Daniel knelt beside his mother with the calm competence he had inherited from both parents. "She was making breakfast," Daniel explained as Thomas gathered Sarah into his arms. "She said she felt dizzy, then she just fell." Thomas carried Sarah to their bed, his mind racing through possibilities. The nearest doctor was 30 miles away in Medicine Creek, but the roads were already treacherous with new snow. If this was something serious, Sarah's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on his face. "Thomas, I am here. How do you feel?" She tried to sit up, then sank back against the pillows with a grimace. "Like I was trampled by cattle." "What happened?" "You fainted. Catherine found you on the kitchen floor." Sarah pressed a hand to her forehead, thinking, "I have been tired lately, and my stomach has been upset." Thomas felt a familiar stirring of hope and terror. They had been through this 4 times before, but Sarah was older now, past 40. Pregnancies at her age carried risks they had not faced in their youth. "Do you think?" "Maybe." Sarah's smile was tentative but growing stronger. It would explain the exhaustion. Over the following weeks, as Sarah's condition became more certain, the whole family adjusted to the news of another addition coming. The older children took on more responsibilities, and Thomas found himself being even more protective than usual. "I am not an invalid," Sarah protested when he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. "You are carrying my child," Thomas replied. Again, at an age when most women are grandmothers. Most women have not spent 20 years building the strength to birth babies and raise them on a ranch. She was right, of course. Sarah had grown strong in ways that went far beyond the physical. The frightened young woman who had knocked on his door had been replaced by someone who could deliver a breech calf, set a broken bone, and defend her family from whatever threats the wilderness might offer. The baby arrived in early spring, a daughter they named Hope. The birth was easier than Thomas had feared, and Sarah recovered quickly, eager to return to the rhythms of ranch life. 5 children, she marveled one evening as she nursed Hope by the fire. When I was 20, I thought I might never have any. And now? Now I think we might need to add another room to the house. Thomas laughed, a sound that still surprised him with its frequency. The man who had once gone months without speaking now filled his days with conversation, laughter, the constant noise of a large and happy family. As Hope grew from infant to toddler, the McKenna Ranch became a gathering place for neighbors and travelers. Sarah's reputation as a healer spread throughout the valley, and people came seeking her help with everything from difficult births to broken bones. Thomas found himself serving as unofficial mediator in disputes between homesteaders and cattlemen. Their home, which had begun as a refuge from the world, had become a center of community. "Do you mind?" Sarah asked one evening after a particularly busy day of visitors. "The way people seem to think our door is always open?" Thomas considered this, watching their youngest daughter play with blocks on the floor while the older children did their lessons at the kitchen table. "Someone once told me that the best things come to those who have the courage to open their door when fate comes knocking," he said. "Maybe fate knocks more than once." Years continued to pass, measured now not in seasons of solitude but in milestones of family life. Graduations, weddings, the arrival of grandchildren who filled the expanded house with even more laughter and chaos. Daniel grew up to become a teacher, fulfilling the dream his father had once abandoned. Catherine married a neighboring rancher and moved only 5 miles away. The twins chose different paths. James became a doctor, Robert a railroad engineer, but both returned often to the place that had shaped them. On Thomas's 60th birthday, as 3 generations of McKennas gathered around the long table Sarah had insisted they build to accommodate their growing family, he looked around at the faces illuminated by candlelight and felt the profound satisfaction of a life lived well. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, following his gaze around the room. "Just remembering," Thomas replied. "The man I used to be." "Do you miss him? That solitary life?" Thomas reached for her hand, still soft despite decades of hard work, still capable of sending warmth up his arm with a simple touch. "How can you miss something that was only half a life?" Later, after the last grandchild had been tucked into bed and the older children had dispersed to their own homes and responsibilities, Thomas and Sarah sat together on the porch swing he had built for her 40th birthday. The ranch spread out before them in the moonlight pastures where their cattle grazed, corrals where their children had learned to ride, gardens where Sarah had coaxed vegetables from the stubborn soil. "Do you think we built something good here?" Sarah asked. Thomas pulled her closer, marveling again at how perfectly she fit against his side after all these years. "I think we built something extraordinary, from a broken wagon wheel and a storm. From choosing each other every day for more than 20 years. As if summoned by their conversation, Hope appeared in the doorway, small and sleep-rumpled in her white nightgown. "Mama, I had a bad dream." Sarah rose to comfort their youngest, but Hope surprised them both by climbing onto Thomas's lap instead, curling against his chest with the complete trust only children possess. "Tell me the story, Papa," she whispered. "About the storm." And so Thomas began again the tale that had become family legend about a lonely man and a brave woman and the night that changed everything. As he spoke, Sarah settled back beside them, adding details he forgot, correcting embellishments that had crept in over the years. It was a story that would be told by their children and grandchildren for generations to come, the story of how love could find a way even in the harshest of places. How 2 broken people could heal each other and build something beautiful from the pieces. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like distant music, and somewhere in the darkness, An owl called to its mate. But inside the warm circle of light cast by the porch lamp, surrounded by the evidence of a life built together through courage and stubbornness and love, Thomas McKenna was exactly where he belonged. He was no longer the loneliest man in 3 counties. He was simply a man who had learned that sometimes the best things come to those who wait and who have the courage to open their door when fate comes knocking, no matter how fierce the storm.